The Smiler at Alton Towers is one of the most popular roller coasters, and it currently holds the world record for the most inversions on any ride, with a grand total of 14. It's an enjoyable coaster, and it's got a lot of fans, but in my opinion, it's a good, but not great roller coaster. It's an impressive feat of engineering to fit 14 inversions into such a small place, but the main problem I have with the Smiler is that all those 14 inversions just feel far too similar. On paper, it seems like the Smiler's got a great variety of inversions, with a batwing, cobra roll, sea serpent roll, dive loops, corkscrews and more, but when you take all these elements back to back, the forces involved and the flow through each inversion feels just too similar. If you've ridden a lot of coasters, you'll know that a vertical loop feels very different to a 0G roll, but the majority of the Smiler's elements have the same basic flow, whereby you rise up, turn upside down and fall back in a half loop. It's here that I'd like to contrast the Smiler with another multi-inversion coaster, Dragon Can at Portaventura. Dragon Can predates the Smiler by some 18 years, but similarly it also held the world record for the most inversions on any coaster at the time that it opened. It may only have 8 compared to the Smiler's 14, but the nature of each inversion and the way in which they're all spaced out makes each one seem different, and results in a far better ride in my opinion. It starts with a drop into a standard vertical loop, and follows this up by sailing high into a dive loop. These two elements naturally feel quite different, as your axis of rotation changes from vertical to horizontal and back again. What follows next is an insanely fast 0G roll, although it's so snappy it's almost like a negative G roll, as you're spun around just so incredibly quickly. You then have a double inversion in the form of a cobra roll, before you rise up into the mid-course brake run. The second half of the ride starts with a drop into another vertical loop, that then leads into the final 2 inversions made up of interlocking corkscrews. The key difference here is that the pattern of acceleration and rotation through the elements in Dragon Can varies from element to element, whereas on the Smiler they're just too similar, with the sensations being the same back to back. There's no pure vertical loop, there's no snappy 0G roll, it almost seems like it's one dive loop after another, producing the same rise up, twist and fall in a half loop or corkscrew sensation over and over again. But what if it didn't have to be like that? What if we could go back to the drawing board and make some changes? Well, I've decided to do just that. Now I'm going to try and be realistic here too, and follow some rules Alton Towers are known to have to stick to. The most significant of these are height and space restrictions. Alton Towers has to keep all their rides hidden below the tree line in order to get local planning permission, so to keep things in a realistic space, I've downloaded a version of the Smiler for Planet Coaster built by a user called Huspy. I've then deleted his admittedly impressively crafted version of the ride, and put a marker in place for the maximum height which I won't exceed. Other than that, I have to include at least 14 inversions, but with a bit more variety than the original Smiler, and include at least one vertical loop and a 0G roll, along with some twisted variations of these elements. One key difference I intend to include is a launch instead of a second lift hill, as I think this will give us more opportunities and make for better pacing. Another difference is that I'll be using trains with clamshell restraints rather than the bulky over-the-shoulder restraints you get in the real Smiler. So with that in mind, let's get building. I've decided to keep the same start as the original version of the Smiler, whereby there's a turnaround that leads straight into a heartline roll below the lift hill. I think this is a perfect start to a ride that focuses on inversions, as right off the bat you're spun head over heels, preparing you for what's to come. After the lift hill is where my version is going to get different though. Rather than the corkscrew drop on the original version of the Smiler, I've decided to make something similar to the barrel roll down drops you get on RMC hybrid coasters, as I think this would be more fun, and right after that drop I've placed a vertical loop. I think it's important that a ride that goes for the record for the number of loops should at least have one standard vertical loop, as in a way it's the purest kind of inversion and a good one to place early on in a ride. The next element I wanted to include is a long 0G stall that leads into an inverted half loop. Now something similar exists on Goliath at Six Flags Great America, but I like my version to spend a bit more time inverted and weightless. After all, this ride is supposed to be all about those inversions. My plans for the rest of the ride went through several different iterations as I experimented with what could possibly fit, and I must say it's given me a new appreciation for the work that went into creating the ride. Rather than show you all the different things I tried that failed, however, I've decided to skip all the way to the end so you can see my final result and I can talk through it. So here it is. I managed to fulfill all the criteria in the end. My ride's got 14 inversions, fits in the required space, and is no taller than the original version of the Smiler. You'll notice my version's quite a bit different though. I also built a rather monolithic looking station, which is about as basic as it gets, as I much prefer putting time into coaster design rather than the scenery. This version is still quite rough, however, as there's some transitions that are still a bit janky and difficult to smooth out in-game, but I consider this a draft version of a possible layout that could undergo some future refinement and tweaks to get it fully up to spec. Again, it starts out with a turnaround that leads into a heartline roll inversion underneath the station before you reach the bottom of the lift hill. After the lift hill, it's got another turnaround which leads into that barrel roll down drop straight into the vertical loop. Now my ride doesn't currently have any theming like the centrepiece of the Smiler, but I'm sure something can be built around this big loop. We then have the 0G stall into a half loop, which may pull a little too much positive G at the base, but with a bit of further tweaking I'm sure it can be done reasonably comfortably. Next we have a nice and smooth 0G roll into another turnaround before we rise up into an unexpected hidden dip over an ejector airtime hill that leads straight into a large Cobra roll. The train is starting to slow a little now, so after another small airtime hill, we have a tight right-hand turn into a launch section, which is another airtime hump similar to several Mac launches. What's next though is a half loop that extends into a long 0G stall. My idea for this is to be a parabolic curve so you're weightless throughout before you snap back round and go over this off-axis airtime hill. Next is a slow heartline roll through the original vertical loop before a snappy diving inversion takes you back into the pit and through a kind of squashed vertical loop variation. This then leads into an inverted top hat, turning you around before another 0G stall and the final corkscrew before a turnaround into the brakes. Overall, I think it's turned out reasonably well. The ending is a little slow, and making that final corkscrew a bit snappier wouldn't hurt, but it's a ride that's met the criteria required by Alton Towers, and whilst it may be a bit unrealistic in some places, I'd sure like to ride it if it existed. I went into this project with only a rough idea of what I wanted to create, and I'm aware I may have overdone the 0G elements on this coaster a bit, essentially nullifying my original goal to create more variety by overusing that element. I think each variation is still quite different on my ride, however, and the sections in between them give sufficient space and have different elements to split them up. I'm also aware my version could have a lower capacity than Alton Towers' ride, as the launch would be a less effective block section so it may not be able to run as many trains, but at least my version of the Smiler would have some unique elements, as that launch pulling back into a 0G stall with several seconds weightlessness would be something I'd love to experience. Things also got a bit crowded in the pit section of my ride, as this was where there was the most energy to complete elements, and it may have been more sensible to have the launch going in the opposite direction so that the higher ground could be utilised more effectively, and thus provide more space for the ride to expand into. I'd like to know other people's opinions on the Smiler and my critique of it. Do you think it's a bit samey with its set of inversions, or is it fine the way it is? Would it benefit from some different kinds of inversions? Maybe not quite in the way I've designed here, but at least in having a vertical loop or a 0G stall or roll. Are there any other coasters that have a clearly defined goal or record they had to break, but in your opinion have the wrong layout and could do with a complete redesign? And finally, do you remember the rumours of a washing machine element that spread throughout rollercoaster forums during the construction of the Smiler, and would it ever have been a good idea to have one on a ride? I suspect the answer to that is no, but I look forward to the comments on this video. I've been RollerCoaster David, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in another video very soon.